Hello everybody, welcome back to part 2 of this amazing Flutter series where we are going to learn Flutter in great depth. So this is part 2 and thus we are going to be building a brand new project using what we have already learned, plus we're going to learn some more advanced topics. So this is the application that we will be building. We're going to be building a to-do application. So you can see here we have a counter showing us how many to-dos we have and how many we have actually completed. And over here we have all of our to-dos. And you can see that it is a scrollable list right over here. And you can see we can actually click on each of these to-dos. We can click on them anywhere, and that's going to update this icon right over here, as well as update this over here. Now, once we have completed all of our to-dos, you can see that it becomes nice and green. So we have this nice scrollable list. And also now what we can do is we can actually go ahead and click on this button and then add a new to-do. So maybe I want to smile. I don't know. That is one of my to-dos. I want to smile. And I can go ahead and add that in there. And you can see here that we have some sort of validation here saying that, hey, we have a limit of 15 characters. So if I were to continuously click here, it doesn't allow me to add more characters than 15. So we're going to add some validation in there. And now what we can do is we can press add. And now you can see that this updates as well. And if I were to scroll all the way down, you can see that I see this to-do. And if I were to click it, now it becomes 7 out of 7. So this is the application that we are going to build. And I think it's going to be a really good application, especially if you already know the basics of Flutter, but you're still kind of brand new. So again, I want to tell you that this is the second part of a series, a Flutter series. So I do expect you to have some Flutter knowledge. For example, I do expect you to know what object-oriented programming is and how to code in Dart. If you're struggling with any of these things that I'm going to be listing, please just watch my first series or maybe just do a quick Google search, try to learn them on your own, and then come back to this video. So I do expect you to know object-oriented programming and how to deal with that in Dart because object-oriented programming is dealt everywhere in Flutter. And then you also should know about widgets. So you should know that the UI components within a Flutter application, they're called widgets. You should know the difference between stateful and stateless widgets. And you should know how we pass data around widgets. And then you should know, just the basics of styling. Actually, in this video, we're going to cover some more advanced styling. This isn't really styled very well, but it was styled. There's more styling components to this than our last application. So let's talk about what you're going to learn. So you're going to learn quite a few new things. So the first thing you're going to learn is how you can render a scrollable list. So over here, you can see that this is a scrollable list. So we're going to learn how to render that. We're going to learn as to how we can deal with user input. So remember, we have this text field over here, and we have to be able to get the user input and actually add it into our to-dos. And then we're going to learn how to add third-party packages inside of our Flutter application. And then we're going to learn just a little bit more about styling. So that is what we are going to be learning, and I'm super excited to have you guys here. And you know what? Let's just get right into it. Now, one thing that I do want to note is, again, in the first video, I talked about how you can download Flutter on your local machine. So if you don't know how to do that, please go back to the first video, watch that, and then you can come back over here. All right, that's awesome, and let's get right into it. Alright, my good friends, in this section what we are going to be doing is building out those to-do card widgets. And typically when I'm building out an application like this, what I like to do is build out the UI first, and then later on we make it functional. So let's go ahead and let's build out those to-do card widgets. Now to do this, what I did was I created just a bare bone Flutter application. I did this by doing Flutter create inside of the terminal, and then I called this application to-do app. So this is the bare bone application. You can do this as well. This is obviously assuming that you have the Flutter SDK downloaded inside of your application. If you haven't, then just watch my previous video. I show you guys how to download Flutter inside of your app. Now also I went ahead and I ran this, so you can just go open this up in VS Code and then just run without debugging. I already did this, and you can see here that I have it up and running in the emulator, and we have our bare bone Flutter application. This is the default application. So let's go ahead, and before we actually go ahead and create our card components, let's just do a little bit of cleaning up. So in here, what I want to do is I want to get rid of this scaffold component. So let's go over here, and for now, let's just replace it with a text. So it's going to replace it with a text, and this is of course inside of the my homepage state. So we're going to also get rid of these comments. Let's get rid of all of this as well. No need for this. Let's get rid of this. Make it very, very bare bone. Let us get rid of this. And then let's get rid of this right here. So we're going to get rid of that. And we're also going to get rid of this. Let's just get rid of some of the comments. Let's get rid of this comment. And we're done. We're pretty much done. So if you were to save this, we get a very ugly application right over here. So now what we want to do is, well, we want to create the card components. But to do this, of course, we need to set up our application in some way. Right now, what we're returning is a text widget. And so we need something a little bit more flexible. And to do this, I like to use the scaffold widget because it contains a lot of different properties like app bar, where we can add an app bar widget, and it places a nice app bar right over here. It also has the floating action button, where we can place a floating action button with an on pressed of null for now. We can go ahead and just add that in. You can see we have that button. But for now, what I want is, I don't want the button for now or the app bar. Instead, what I actually want is just the whole body, everything right over here. So what we can do here instead is use, well, the body, and then the body can be a center widget. So we can use a center widget. Now remember, the center widget is a widget that centers everything that is within it. So for example, this is going to take in a child, and if I were to say text hello world, you should see this right in the center. So that is what we are going to be using. Now what we want now is, instead of a text, we want a column, because our cards are going to be placed vertically. Because we're going to have multiple cards, of course, and they're going to be placed vertically. So let's have a column instead. And this column, of course, is going to take an array of widgets. So it's going to take in this wonderful array of widgets. All right, cool. So now in here, what we want to do is we want to add that card component. So instead of actually creating that card component here inside of this main.dart file, let's actually follow best practices and create a widgets. We're going to create a widgets directory. So we're going to create that. Let me just see if this is zoomed in enough. No, that's way too zoomed in for me. I think this is okay. And so now what we can do is we can create this widgets directory, and in here we can call this to-do cards.dart. So to-do cards.dart. And now how do we create widgets? Well, remember, widgets are just classes. And if you have the Flutter extension installed, what you can do is you can do st, and you can pick between either a stateless widget or a stateful widget. Now, what are we doing? Are we managing state in this card? Well, actually not really. Well, you might think yes, we are, because that checkbox with completed and not completed is state, but I think it's actually better to manage that state outside of that widget. So we want to manage that state somewhere else outside of that widget rather than inside of the card widget. So to do that, because it's not actually managing that state, we can use a stateless widget. And you can see here we get some boilerplate. Now I'm going to call this to-do card. Very, very simple. We're going to get rid of this. And you can see here that there's a bunch of errors, and that's because we need to import this Dart file. So let's go ahead and let's import that right in there. All right, very, 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 very cool. So now what we want to do is, well, we see this, and what we want to do is ultimately we want to create our card. Now to do this, inside of this container widget, what we can do is we can actually add, or you know what, actually instead of the container widget, we can have a card widget. And this card widget can take in a child as well. And we're going to use the text widget, and we're going to say, hello world. So we're going to go ahead and say that. We're going to put a colon in here. And now if we save this, nothing renders because inside of our main.dart file, we actually have to render it inside of the column. Now to do this, we can import it and then use it, or we can just go ahead and try to use it. And then it's going to, as you can see, auto import. So it's going to auto import that. So if we were to save this, you can see at the very top, we have this right over here. So let's actually move this in the center. And now, of course, to do this, we need to use the main axis alignment inside of the column widget. So we're going to use the main axis alignment, and we're going to say the main axis alignment dot center. Remember, the main axis alignment of the column is vertically, and we want to center all our components vertically. So you can see here that we have this right here. Now, you might be able to, very faintly notice that there's a little bit of some shadow here, a little bit of a border, and that's exactly what the card component it's doing. It's just supplying us with a little bit of, shadow as well as a little bit of border, etc. Okay, cool. So one thing that I'm not really liking is I don't like how we don't have any padding in here. So what we can actually do to fix the padding issue is wrap the child inside of a container. Because remember, the container is the class that is going to have a lot of different styling that we won't get out of the box. So you can say here, hello world. And if you were to save this, this is going to look exactly the same. But now what we can do is we can provide it with some padding. So we can say that the padding is edge inset dot all, and then, I played around with it. I liked 20. So you can see here now we have some padding. And also we can also supply it with a height. So this is going to be a fixed height. And I'm going to say that I want all my cards to be 125 pixels. So you can go here, you can see here that this is our fixed height. All right, very, very, very cool. So one thing now is I want to actually center this text, right in the center. So how do we go about doing that? Well, to do that, what we can do is instead of using a child text here, we can use a child center here. So we can say a child center, and then over here we can supply it with our text. And now you can see that this is centered right in the middle, and it's actually taking up the space, the entire space right over here. So the center, remember, it takes up as much space as it possibly can. So you can see here that it is nice and centered. So now what we want to do is, we wanted to actually center it vertically, but we really didn't want to center it horizontally because we wanted our text to be here, and then we wanted the icon to be here. So instead of actually having text here, what we can do is use row. So we can use row, and we can say children. We can say that this is going to be an array of widgets. And then over here we can have our text. And then as the second widget, we can have icon. And we can say icons dot check. So if we were to save this, you can see here that we have our row. Now remember, the row is going to take up also the entire space. So any content that it puts within it is going to be located to the left. So now what we want to do is we want this one to be here. So the actual text to be on the left and the actual icon to be way on the right. How do we do that? Well, we do that by going to the row and doing a main axis alignment. The main axis alignment for the row is horizontally. And so now what we can say is main axis alignment dot, and over here we're going to use space between. If you're familiar with Flexbox, this is going to make a lot of sense to you. But essentially what space between is, we want to have the most amount of space between elements. So in order to achieve that here, we're going to have this element here, and then this element all the way, the icon all the way over here. If we had 3 elements, for example, we're going to have this text here, this over here, and then this over here. That's going to have the most space between them. You can play around, honestly, with space around or space evenly. Really, most of the time I use space between. So you can see here that now that is done and dusted. So one thing that I really want to work on is, well, the text. The text is kind of small. So let's add a little bit of styling to the text. To do that, of course, we're going to go to the text widget. And let's change it to an actual to-do. So let's say pet the cat. And then over here, what we can say is we want the styles. And then over here, we're going to use text styles. Text styles. And over here, we're going to use, things like the font size. So we want the font size to be 25. We want the font weight to be, well, font weight dot bold. So if we were to save this, you can see here we have a nice, beautiful, big to-do. And now what we want to do here is change the color of this. This is really, really easy. We can supply it with color, and we can say colors.green. You can save that, and now we should have a green. We don't. Why is that? We should have a green. Nope, still we do not. Let's save that. And there we go. Maybe I just didn't save it properly. And there we go. Now we have green. Now, one thing that I want to note is I'm not really liking how this card is spanning the entire text, entire screen over here. What I ultimately want is, I want this to take up 90% of the width of the phone, not the whole width of the phone. So I want a little bit of spacing here. So I want 90%. Now, how do I do this? Well, what I could potentially do if I wanted to is go over here to the container and also supply it with the width. So I can say something like width of 300. And you can see here that now the width is a little bit smaller. Maybe I can do a little bit of calculation, and I can say, this is approximately 90%. And you know what? Maybe this is approximately 90% for this screen. However, if we had a screen that was a little bit smaller, it actually might lead to a little bit of an overflow. Or if we had a screen that is a little bit bigger, then it obviously won't be 90%. So how do we get the width to be 90% regardless of the screen size? So if let's say the screen size is 100 pixels, then the card width is going to be 90 in that case. But if it's 200 pixels, it should be 180. So always going to be dynamically changing. Well, you might be thinking, okay, what if I just said something like string 90%? Well, that doesn't work because the width only takes in a double. So unfortunately, we can't actually do this within the container. So what we actually need to do is actually wrap this whole thing inside of another very, very commonly used widget called fractionally sized box. So the fractionally sized box is going to take in a child, and that's where we're going to actually go ahead and just paste in our wonderful card. And if we were to save this right now, you can see that nothing has really changed. Let's actually get rid of this width for now. So you can see here that nothing has changed. But now what we can do is actually supply this with a width factor. You can think of this as just the percentage that we want this to be. And so here what we can say is 0.9. And you can see here that now it is 0.9. It's actually 90%. And now regardless of the screen size, it's going to dynamically change. If I were to change this to 50%, you can see here that it changes to 50%. So that is how we can dynamically set the width of our card. All right, cool. So now the very, 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 very last thing is let's go over here and let's just add some more cards just so we can see it in action. So just let's go here and okay, cool. You can see that it's good. Now the only issue is if I were to add, let's say 3 more cards, we're gonna get a little bit of an overflow. You can see here we get this overflow problem. Plus, of course, they're not clickable. So let's go ahead and continue out our application. All right, so in this section, let's go ahead and let's add that counter that we're gonna see at the very top of the screen. So right now we have, I don't know, I think something like 7 to-dos. We can actually check by looking over here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we should see something like 0 out of 7 or 6 out of 7 or whatever, however how much we completed. And we should have that counter at the very top. Now to do this, again, let's follow best practices and let's go ahead and let us use another widget component. And I'm going to call this component, well, counter. So I'm going to say counter.dart. And this is, again, going to be a stateless widget, because what we're going to do is we're not going to manage the state there. We're just going to pass the data into it. So we're going to use a stateless widget, and this is going to be called count. And we'll pass the data into it later, but for now, we'll just hard code it. So let's go to here. Let's import this material Dart, of course, because we need that, of course. So now what we can actually do here is, well, this is currently wrapped in a container. So what we can actually do now is have a child that is a text. And then we can give this text, well, for now, let's just do something like 0 out of 7. So if I were to go to the main.dart file, now I can go ahead over here and say something like counter. So I can auto import the counter and I can add that in there and we should see 0 out of 7, very, very small right over here. So one thing, of course, that I want to do is let's add some padding, let's add some spacing. So inside of the container, we can add some margin actually, not padding, let's add margin instead. And we're gonna use edge inset, and we're gonna use .all, and we're gonna use 40. So we're gonna go ahead, save this, and we should get this over here. So we got some nice little padding. Now also what I want to do is, of course, I want to make this a little bit larger. So let's use some text or some styles. And this is gonna be text style. And then let's use a font size that is relatively big. So let's say 75 is the font size. Let's, yeah, and that's it for now. Let's just go ahead and there we go. We should have our good little application. All right, cool. So we have that up and running, and I think that's pretty much it for this section. Of course, right now it's not dynamic. We hard coded everything, but that right there is our application. And of course, what we wanted to do is we want to render it inside of the column. And that again is what we're doing right over here. We're rendering it inside of the column. So, okay, that's pretty much it. And I'll see you guys in the next section. So far, we have created our application, but all of our content is static. For example, we went ahead and we hard coded this. We also hard coded these things over here. Everything is static and we're not really dynamically generating these things. So in this section, what we're gonna actually do is we'll work on the state of our application so that we can dynamically render things. So for example, we can dynamically render the cards as well as also dynamically render the completion statuses right over here. So let's begin with the cards first, because I think it's the most complex. Actually, this has some relative complexities, but we'll talk about this first. So let's look at the card itself. What kind of state is it holding? Well, it's holding the titles, the to-do title. In this case, it's pet the cat, but it's also holding this over here. So the completed status, is it completed or is it not completed? And if it's not completed, we should show an X, but if it is completed, we should show a check. Now, another piece of state that it should also have under the hood is some sort of unique identifier so that we're able to, uniquely identify across cards. We probably don't want to rely on the title because as you can see here, we can have duplicate titles, duplicate titles that are exactly the same. So that is what's inside of the card itself. And because we have so much information, I think it's best that we use a map. So we have a title key as well as a completed key as well as an ID key. Now, this is just one card. We have a list of cards. So maybe we should probably use a list of maps. And that's exactly what we should use. So what I want to do is I want to deal with the state inside of the main.dart file. So inside of this right over here, right under line 29, we're going to add that state. So for now, we're going to hard code that state, but later on, we're going to dynamically generate it. So I'm going to say final list, and I'm going to call this to-dos, and this is going to be an array. and we should have, or a list. And over here we should have a map, and we're gonna say ID, and this could be just any random gibberish. And then we're also gonna have a title, so we can say something like pet the cat. And then over here we can have a completed status, So we can say this is gonna be a Boolean, so we can say true. And of course now what we can do is we can put the semicolon, and now we're done our list. So I actually went ahead and I have some stuff copied in my clipboard, so you can go ahead and copy this yourself, or you can use my GitHub page to get this. But yeah, I copied this from our clipboard, so we have, you know, an array of maps. So we have clean the room, as well as pet the cat, and then dance. So now what we can do is we can map through this array and actually render it inside of the column. Now, how do we actually map through an array? So we want to iterate through every single array, or every single map inside of this array, or inside of this list. Sorry, I come from a JavaScript background, so I'm going to use the terms interchangeably. But in Dart, the official definition or the official wording is called list. So I want to loop over this list and then get every single map value, and for each item inside of this list, I want to render a to-do card. Well, how am I going to do that? Well, actually really easily. So what I can actually do is get the to-dos variable and actually just put it right in here. And what I can say is, well, I want to go ahead and map through this. I want to map through this. So if you're familiar with the JavaScript, you're probably familiar with this over here. But what this is doing is it's going to map through every single element inside of this list. And for each element that it is iterating over, we can actually get it inside of the callback. So we have a callback here, and we can actually just go ahead and do something like this. So we can get to do, and then what we can do is we can return the to-do card. So we can return the to-do card. This might seem a little bit confusing, and hopefully I explained it as well as I can. But essentially what we're doing is here we have our to-dos list, and we're using the .map method. And what the .map method does is it iterates through every single element inside of this to-dos list. Now, for the element that it is currently iterating over, we can actually get it and pass it in here as the parameter inside of our callback. So in the first iteration, the to-do is going to be this. The second iteration, that this to-do is going to be this one over here, and then the last iteration is going to be this. And then for each iteration, we are going to be returning the to-do card. So now what we can do is we can actually get rid of all these hard-coded to-do cards, and we can use this instead. Now what this does is actually returns, what it does is it returns an array of to-do cards. So the map method eventually is going to return something like this, because now we have 3 of these. It's going to return something like this. So it's going to return something like this, and that's kind of problematic. And the reason why that's problematic is inside of here, what we have is an array, and we're basically passing the counter and then an array of to-do cards. So for example, inside of the column, it's going to kind of look like this. So we're going to have the array, we're going to have the counter, and then what we're going to have is this array of to-do cards. So we're going to have this array of to-do cards. So what we need to do is somehow destructure this out so that we can get rid of this array and put all of the content within this parent level array. So it kind of looks something like this ultimately. Well, we can do that by simply just doing ... by destructuring out the array and placing it inside of the parent array. So hopefully that made sense, but that is how we can do that. Now what we can see here is, since we have 3 elements inside of our list, we should see 3 to-do cards. So if we were to save this and go back, that's exactly what we see. We see 3 to-do cards. Now, one thing that I want to note is that, well, of course, the to-do cards are all pet the cat, pet the cat, pet the cat. And the reason for that is because we hard-coded that in there. So what we actually need to do is, well, we need to get the data inside of this card component. So inside of the to-do card, we need to get this piece of information. And this is where this to-do is going to come into place. So first of all, we need to be able to accept this information inside of the to-do cards.dart file. And of course, I do expect you to know how to do this, but we do this through the constructor. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to define the things that we're going to need. So we're going to need the title. So we can say title, and that's going to be a string. You can say final, and then we also want the completed, which is going to be a Boolean. And we also need, very, very important, we also need the you know what, we'll also take the ID, might as well. I think that's relatively important as well. So let's just take in the ID, which is going to be a string, and also the ID. All right, cool. And now what we, to really accept them inside of the constructor, we're just going to use the named params. So we're going to say required, and then we're going to say title, or sorry, this.title. And then we're going to do the same thing over here. We're going to say required. And actually for now, we don't really need the ID. The ID was just kind of an additional thing that I wanted to add just because it's really important to have IDs, but for now we don't really need it. So we can go ahead and save this. And now what we can do is in here, instead of using the string, we can just say title. So we can just say simply title. And then over here in the icon, what we want to do is we want to kind of dynamically render this. If it is completed, we want to show the check. But if it's not completed, then what we want to do is show the X. Well, how do we do this? Well, we can use the ternary operator. So what we can say here is if this is completed, so if this is completed, then we can use question mark. So if this is completed, the thing after the question mark is the thing that is going to be returned if this statement is actually true. So if completed is true, we're going to return this. And then else is the colon. We're going to say icons.close. So this is a ternary operator. So again, just to quickly define what's happening here, this right here is a condition. So this is either going to be true or false. If this is true, is going to return anything after the question mark. So this over here, the first thing after the question mark, so the check. If it is false, however, then it's going to return the thing after the colon, which is close. So this is kind of like just an if-else statement. And over here, I encourage you to kind of do the same because we're going to do the same thing over here. So here, what we're going to say is, well, if it's completed, then the color is going to be green, and then else, the color is going to be red. So now what we can do is go back to the main.dart file, and you can see that it's complaining at the moment because, well, we have to pass it in the title. And then we can do that by accessing the todo.title. So we can say todo.title, todo.title. Okay, and the reason why this is failing right now is because we need to go over here, and then we have to also pass it with the completed status. And so we can say todo.completed. So if we were to save this and go over here, we actually see this expected error. Now the reason why we get this error is because over here it says that the title is not an actual instance of this string object. And the reason for this is because Flutter is not really, or Dart is not really that smart. It doesn't know that title is an actual key inside of this map. So what we actually need to do is define the type of this inside of our directories. So over here, what we can do is inside of the lib, we can add modals. So we can add modals, and then inside of the modals, we're going to add a very important, well, model. And this is going to be the to-do model. So we can say here to-do.dart. Now this is going to be a class, but of course it is not going to be a component by any means. So we can say something like class to-do, and this is going to be, well, it's going to have a string that is an ID. It's also going to have a string that is a title, and it's also going to have a Boolean that is completed. Now, of course, how are we going to pass this data in? Well, we're going to pass that data in through the constructor. So we're going to say required this.id, and let's just go ahead and copy this. And we're going to say required this.title, and then we're going to say required this.completed. And this is a much better way of doing things, mainly because, well, for one, now Dart is going to know the type of the list, and also is going to 100% enforce that the structure of this list looks exactly like this. Because if we had this kind of dynamic stuff, you could accidentally, I don't know, misspell title. We could add other things. We can make this a string and not a Boolean. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and save this. And then in here, we can say that this is a list of to-dos. And of course, we're going to auto import that. Now in here, of course, it's going to get mad at us because now we don't want to supply it with the map. We want to actually supply it with the to-do. So we can go over here and say to-do, and then we can pass the ID. And the ID is going to be this ID over here. And we're going to also pass in the title. Oops, the title. And then the title is going to be clean your room. And then, of course, we're going to supply it with the completed. So the completed, which is true. So this is all fine. Let's actually just comment the rest out so we can get rid of the errors. And now what we can do is we can just go ahead and paste this a few more times and just copy the other ID, paste that in there. We can pet the cat, which is the title, paste that in there, and make this false. And then the last thing is we're going to go ahead and copy this, paste that in there. We're going to go ahead over here, dance, paste that in there, and we're going to leave completed as true. So now if I were to save this, now if I were to do to-do dot, you can see here we get to-do.title. We actually see the auto format. And now what we can do is we can refresh this and wait. Let's just wait a little bit. It's performing the hot reload, and of course we still get no more errors. Okay, there we go. So you can see here now it's actually being dynamically rendered. So you can see here clean room checked off, pet the cat, X, dance checked off. That's amazing. That is really cool. So that's terrific. But now let's actually handle the state for this counter. In this section, we're going to deal with handling this state right over here, the state of the counter. So right now, again, we hard-coded this to 0/7, but of course we want to dynamically generate this. And this is really going to be dependent on, well, two factors. The denominator over here, 7, is going to be the total number of to-dos we have inside of our list. In this case, we have 3 to-dos, so this should be 3. And obviously the numerator, well, that's going to be the number of completions. So over here we have 2 completions and 1 X, so that should be 2 out of 3. So you might think that this is relatively simple, but there's some underlying complexities. Now to deal with this, let's actually go to our counter and let's just go ahead and ask for what we want, and we'll figure out how we're going to pass that data in later. So what do we want? Well, we want an integer called the number of to-dos. So the number of to-dos. And we also want, well, we want another integer that is the total completions. So how many we actually completed, how many to-dos we completed. And of course, to trigger the counter, all we have to do now is say required this dot number of to-dos, and then similarly over here we can say required this dot total completions. Let's add our semicolon here and we should be all good. And over here now what we can do is just dynamically render it, and we can use string interpolation for this. So we can say $, and then we can say total. This should be total completions. And then over here as our denominator, that should be the number of to-dos. So if we were to save this, this is going to break our application, mainly because our main.dart file doesn't have that piece of information. So now if I were to pass that information in, so something like number of to-dos, let's just say 3, because, well, it is 3, or number of to-dos is 3, and then total completions is 2, and if we dynamically pass that in, you can see that now it is 2 out of 3. All right, cool, but of course what we want to do is actually not hard code it, because we are kind of still hard coding it here. We want to somehow compute this. Well, let's talk about the number of to-dos. The number of to-dos is really easy. It's just how many elements we have inside of this list. So simply we can just get the length of the list and pass it in as the number of to-dos. So we can say to-dos dot length. Very, very simple. And this way, if I were to add or maybe even reduce a to-do and I were to save it, we should get 2 out of 2 in a year. Why is this not working? It definitely should be working. So let's just refresh this. You can tell that it didn't refresh because also this should be gone as well. Sometimes it is just extremely slow. Oh, there we go. So there we go. Now we see 2 out of 2, and you can see that this is dynamically generated, which is really cool. So now if I undo this one, we should see the changes here as well. I'm just gonna click refresh, but you guys get the point. I'm not gonna wait for it. And my computer, I'm not sure why. Maybe it's gonna be a little faster in your computer, but sometimes there's just a little bit of a delay, as you can see. So now the next step is to deal with this numerator right over here. And this one's gonna be a little bit more complicated because we're not just getting, the to-dos.length. We actually have to somehow compute the total number of to-dos completed. So to do that, off the top of my head, I think we should probably iterate over every single to-do and then check if it is completed. If it is completed, then we increment some variable by 1. That's what I think the best approach is. Now to do that, of course, we're gonna have to put that inside of a function. So let's go about doing that right now. So over here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna have a function that's gonna return an integer. And I'm gonna call this calculate total completions. So calculate total completions. And this is gonna be var total completions. And initially, total completions. Initially, that's going to be equal to 0. Very, very, very simple. And now what we're going to do is we're going to iterate through every single element. And to do this, we're going to not use map. We're going to use for each. Because map returns an array. We don't want to return that. What we want to do is we want to just iterate through every element and perform some action. So we're going to do to-dos.for each. And then for each element, of course, we can get the element inside of the callback. And then for each element, what we're going to do is we're going to do a conditional check. So we're going to say if to-do.completed. So if it is completed, then what we want to do is, well, get the total completions is equal to total completions plus 1. Or honestly, what we can just do is total completions plus, which is pretty much total completions plus equals, total completions equals total completions plus 1. So that's what we're gonna do. And then, of course, at the very end, we need to return the total completions. Very, very simple. And let's put our little colon over here. So over here, we have our wonderful function. And now, very simply, what we can do is in here actually just call this function. So we can go ahead here and pass this function. We're not going to just pass the function, we're actually going to invoke it so it returns a number. So now if we were to save this, and now if we were to go back, well, it's 2 out of 3, but before it was 2 out of 3, so you don't really know if it has changed. But let me go ahead and change this to false. And then this might take some time. It's so annoying how long it takes, to be honest. I might even have to press the refresh button. I should see an X here, and I should see this turn into 1. There we go. Okay, cool. That took some time, but you can see that this works perfectly fine. Now this takes some time just because we're developing inside of our local machine. If you actually go ahead and host this application, it's going to be significantly faster. It's going to be super, super fast. So don't worry about that. It's just that my machine, it's a pretty fast machine, but I guess it just can't handle being really fast with Flutter development. All right, so that's pretty much it. And we kind of figured out how we can handle our state. Now, the next step, the next way I think we should actually handle our state is the ability to add more to-dos. Now, to do this, of course, we're going to need that button. We're going to need that, that modal to kind of pop up. And we're going to need to handle the text input. So there's actually a lot of things that we need to do. So let's go about doing that in the next section. In this section, we are going to be talking about modals. So what do I mean by that? Well, over here, we're going to have some sort of button. And when we click this button, what I want is some modal to pop up from the bottom. And it's going to have the text field. And this is where we can actually add another to-do. So how do we create this wonderful modal with this really cool animation? Well, it's actually really, really easy in Flutter. Now, to do this, of course, we need to have somewhere to click to trigger the modal. So to do this, I'm going to use the floating action button. And Scaffold has a field over here called floating action. So I'm going to say floating action, and I'm going to say that this is going to be the floating action button. And for now, the on pressed, I'm just going to have it as an empty callback function, anonymous function. And I'm going to give this a child. And I'm going to say that the child of this is going to be an icon. And of course, icons are going to take icons dot, and I'm going to say icons dot add, because we want, you know, a plus sign. So icons dot add. So let's go ahead and let's just save this, and we should see a button right over there. All right, that's very, very, very cool. So now what we want to do is when we actually click on this button, we want to trigger that modal. So how do we do this? Well, it's surprisingly really easy. There's actually a function, a built-in function that does this for us. And this function is called, show modal bottom sheet. So what we want to do is we want to call this function. So we can say here, show modal bottom sheet. And you can see here that this function is going to take in a few parameters, and this is going to be the context. So the context, as you can see here, we have our build context. This is the context of the widget that we are currently in. And this is right now the whole the kind of our app widget. This is the my homepage widget. But you can see here over here, we also have another context. This is the context of this widget. So what we want to do is we want to supply it with the context that is in, and the context that we're in right now is the whole application. So this whole application. So to do that, all we have to really do is just pass this context into here, which is done already. And then as the second parameter, we have the builder. And this is where we pass in a callback function that is going to build out the widget that we want to pop up as a modal. So instead of builder here, what we can do is just pass in some sort of callback function. And now it's failing because, of course, what we want to do is we want to return a widget. Now this callback function is going to take in the build context. So don't worry about this right now. This is something that Flutter just automatically passes in. And now what we can do here is simply say that we want to return, and we can literally return any widget that we want, and it's going to act as a modal. So we can say hello world as text. So I'm going to just quickly just show you that this works, and then I'm going to go over this again. So if I were to click this, you can see here that we get this modal, and we can actually go ahead and click out of it. And we can click it, click out of it, click it, click out of it. So again, what is going on here? Well, if we want to trigger this modal, we have this built-in function that we get from Flutter called show modal bottom sheet. This takes the context, which is going to be this over here, the context of the widget that we're currently on. And in this case, this context is going to represent our whole application. And then over here, we have this builder, and this is going to be a method that is going to, well, build out the widget that we want to be our modal. In this case, it is going to be a text. So what I actually like to do, instead of actually just putting this inside of a callback, let's go all the way up here and let's create a method for this. So I'm going to call this show add to do modal. So this is a show add to do modal, and over here we're going to get the build context. So the build context is going to be passed in when we invoke this. And then over here, we are going to just cut and paste this logic. So we're going to cut this logic and just paste it right in here. And this should be completely fine. So we should cut and paste this logic. We can paste it right in there. And now what we can do is simply inside of our callback, just call this right over here. So we can go ahead and call this. And then we can, of course, pass in the context. All right, that's pretty much it. And that should do the exact same thing. But now what we want to do is, of course, we don't want to just display text. We want to display the actual modal, like the whole modal. We want to display text field, etc. So what I want to do is, let's go over here, and what I want to do is I want to actually create a brand new component, and this component is going to be the new to do component, because we're going to use this component to add new to dos. So let's go here and let's add, or sorry, not a component, I'm thinking about React sometimes, a new widget. So I'm going to call this new to do. Let's go here and we're going to say st, we're going to say that this is a stateless, and actually, you know what, I'm thinking about, in hindsight, this will be a stateful widget. Why will it be a stateful widget? Well, it's going to be managing the text of our application, because we're going to have the input text to be in there. So it's going to actually be managing that. So let's actually make this a stateful widget. And in here, what we're going to do is very simply, we're going to call this new to do. We're going to get rid of some of these extra things like this. And over here, we have new to-dos. You can call this new to-do state. And similarly over here, we can call this is going to extend state, and this is going to be extending the new to-do. All right. Very, very cool. And let's go over here. Let's just fix some of these issues as well. So we have here extends the stateful widget. And then over here, we should have something like the state. And this is going to be the stateful widget. So stateful widget. And then this is going to, well, pass this value in right here. All right, cool. So that's pretty awesome. We have created our stateful widget. And now what we want to do is, well, of course, instead of rendering the text, we want to render that new to do. So we want to go ahead and render that new to do. And one thing that I actually want to note that I was actually kind of reminded of is we should probably make these private. So this one over here, we should probably also make some of these things private as well. If they're private, we can still pass them along, but we can't import them. So things that, you know, like maybe this probably should be private as well. So over here, we should make this private. Maybe, yeah, I think this is good for now. So let's make some of these things private, which is pretty good. So now what we can do is over here, you know, we can say the child is the text. We can say hello. And now if I were to click on this, we should see hello. All right, cool. So one thing that I want, of course, is I want to make this bigger. And actually, I want this to be as big as the screen itself. Now, how am I going to do that? Well, it's not that difficult, actually. So to do that, what we need to do is go back to our new underscore todo.dart file. And then over here inside of the container, we can just supply it with a height. And this height can be double infinity, which means that, well, we want it to take up the maximum height that it can. So if we were to save this, you can see here that now that's exactly what it does. So you can see here, now we have this really, really cool modal. Now that we have created our modal, let's just make it a little bit less useless, because right now all it does is just render this text over here saying hello. Not very useful. What we really want is in the middle of the modal, we want to have some input saying that, hey, add a new to-do. And then in here, we also should have a button saying add. And you can click on or tap on this button, and it then should add that to-do into, well, these to-dos right over here. So let's go about doing that right now. So the first thing that I want to do is, again, let's remember, I want the text to be right in the middle. So honestly, I think what we should probably use in this case is a center. So let's use a center. Actually, thinking about this again, maybe it's best if we use a column and just align things in the center, because we're gonna have to use a column to have our text input and then our add button. So let's go over here and let's add a column. And the column is gonna take children, of course, or we're gonna say widget. And then over here, what we are going to do is the first thing is it's going to be the text field. So we need the text field for this. So if I were to save this, you should see some sort of text field right over here. And let's actually go ahead and center this right now. And I hope you guys know how to do this. You can do main access alignment dot center. So this is the widget that we're going to use to actually input things inside of our text field. So you can see here, or you can see here that now we have our text field. We can actually start like clicking and adding some text as well. We can, of course, finish it off, and you can see, you know, it works perfectly fine. But there are, I think, a few limitations right now. Well, there's some stylistic annoyances, and then there's also, this doesn't really look like a text field. It kind of just looks like a straight line. So what we need to do is we need to add some sort of label telling it that, hey, this is a new to-do. This is where you add your new to-do. So to do this, the text field, what it does is it takes the decoration property. So we're going to say the decoration property. Let's get rid of these. And this is going to take in input decoration. So input decorations, we're specifying that this is going to be an input decoration. And then over here, what we want is label text. And this is going to take in some text, not a text input, but some actual text. Or sorry, not a text widget, but some actual text. So over here, we can say new to do. And you can see here now we have new to do. So now I actually know that is an input. And what's cool about this, if I actually go ahead and tap on it, you can see that we have some new style changes. All right, that is really, really cool. Now let's just fix some of the annoyances about the margin. So over here, what we can do is we can just add inside of the container, we can add some margin. And of course, here we're going to use edge inset dot all, and I'm going to say 10. So now we have, you know, some good spacing. All right, wonderful. So now what we need is to have a button right over here. So we need to have a little bit of a button saying add. So inside of the column, we're going to add another widget, and this is going to be a text button. So a text button. And the on pressed for now, we'll just have an anonymous function. Later on, it's going to be more complex, of course. And over here for the child, and let's actually just separate this up a little bit better. The child is going to be text, of course. And this is going to say add. So add. So if I were to save this, we should get this over here. Now I don't like that it's kind of centered in the middle, so what we can actually do is move everything in the cross axis to the right, which is the end. So over here we can say cross axis alignment, cross axis alignment dot end. Save that. You can see here now it's added all the way to the right. All right, cool. So that is terrific. That's awesome. And now let's see. Honestly, I was thinking about adding some text styling, but I kind of like the way that it looks right now, so I'm totally cool with that. So that is it. So that's pretty much it. But now what we want to do is, well, we want to get the text input. So right now the user is gonna, of course, add some text. So they're gonna add some text. We want to somehow save that inside of our application. Well, where are we going to save that? Well, the way that in Flutter we save it is something called a controller. So what we're going to do is we're going to save this text input inside of a controller. You can kind of think of a controller just as a string. It's okay. So what we're going to say is we're going to say that this is the to-do controller. And we're going to say that this is equal to a text editing controller. So this might seem a little confusing right now, but don't worry, after we actually go through the example, you'll just understand that this is a way where we can actually store the text that the user has input inside of a text field right inside of the variable that is the controller. So over here we can do that. And then over here we can also define that this is a text editing controller. So you can say that this is a text editing controller. And now to link this controller to the text field, because we could have multiple text fields, of course, what we do is we go to the text field and we supply it with the controller. And over here we supply it with that controller. And so now what I'm going to do is when we press this button, what I want to do is I want to print the controller, and then from the controller we're going to get the text value. So the text value. And so let me go ahead here and just open up the terminal. Hope I'm running. All right, it's not. Okay, so you know what I'm gonna do instead? Actually, I'm gonna try to print it. I don't know if I'll be able to catch it because the sync is not really working. But if I were to, let's go ahead and add here and press add. Let's add a few times and then go to the debug console right over here. You should see that the text has been outputted. So this is the text inside of my form, and I was able to press add, and it was, well, outputted right over here. So now what we want to do is when we actually press this, what we want to do is eventually add it to this array inside of the main.dart file. Or sorry, again, I was mistaken. I mean list when I say this. So really what we want to do is we want to call some sort of function that is going to add this into the the to-do into this list. So let's actually create that function right over here. And we're going to call this function add to-do. So it's not going to return anything. So we're going to say void add to-do, and it is going to take in the to-do as a parameter. And so what we're going to do here is we are going to, of course, change the state of our application. So we're going to have to use set state. And then over here, we're going to say todos.add. And what we want to do is we want to add a new instance of the to-do. So we're going to say to-do. And then for now, the ID is just going to be, we're just going to hard code the ID. This is not really a good practice, of course, because, well, in this case, the ID is going to be the same for every single element, and then it's not really an ID at that point. We're going to say completed. The completed is always going to be false for now, or false to begin with, and then you'll be able to change it afterwards. And then lastly, the title is going to be, well, the to-do that you have passed in. And so now what we can do is, well, we have this function right over here, and let's end it off with this, and then let's actually make this a private function. And so what we want to do is we want to, of course, pass it into this right here, this new to-dos widget. We know how to do that, of course. So to do that, we go into the widget, which is the stateful widget. And then we use the constructor. So we're going to go to the stateful widget, and then we're going to say, first of all, what do we expect to get? Well, we expect to get a function that takes in a string as a parameter, and we're going to call this function add to do. And then inside of the new to do stateful widget, we're going to call the constructor, and we're going to say required this dot add to do. Very, very simple. All right, cool. So now what we want to do is, well, we want to call this function on the on press. Now, how do we do that? You know, it might seem really simple. Of course, we're just going to do that by doing add to do, and then we're going to call the add to do, and we're going to pass this in. But you can see we have an error here. Now, why do we have this error? Well, right now we're in the state, the new to do state. However, the actual function is in this class over here, the new to do stateful widget class. So this right now has no access to this. So how do we kind of communicate the access? Well, it's actually really, really simple. To do that, all we have to do is any property that lives in here, we can access it inside of the state by first prepending widget and then doing dot add to do. Now, if the thing doesn't exist, of course, it's going to trigger an error. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and save this. And over here, now it's going to yell at us because we have to pass in the add to do. So let's go ahead here and let's pass that in. So we're going to pass in add to do, and we're going to pass in that method. Let's get rid of that comma. And now if we were to save this, we should see no more debugs. Actually, over here we have a debug. So over here it says new to do with matching arguments, new to do, blah, blah, blah. I'm not really sure why this is broken, to be quite frank. So we got new to do here, add to do. You know what, let's just refresh this. And if this fails again, then I'll have to pause the video and figure out why it failed. So refresh it. Looks like it's okay. And I think it is okay. All right. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and click on this. And then we can say fix things. And then we can say add. And now the thing is that it doesn't automatically remove. So let's actually just exit out of it ourselves. But you can see here that, well, it has added. And of course, we don't have a scroll right now, but you can see here, you don't really have to take my word for it. You can see it yourself. Fix things has been added. That is terrific. But there's a ton of things that we still need to do. For example, once we actually add a to-do, I'd like the modal to just disappear by itself. Of course, we also need to fix this scroll view right over here. And another thing that I can think of is, well, I also want to add this validation. So in this section, actually, let's do the validation right now because it's really, really simple and easy. So the way that we are going to validate this, and what I mean by validation is we want to only have a maximum length so that we don't have like a super, super huge to do. So over here, what we can do is we can go to the text field, and then inside of the text field, we can just say that we want a max length, and we can say 15. And so by doing that, now if I were to press this, you can see here that we get this, this kind of limitation right over here. All right, so that's pretty much it for this section. In the next sections, we're going to work on the problems that I have illustrated. Now that we have the ability to add more to-dos inside of our application, we've run into this overflow issue. And obviously this is a very big problem that we need to solve. And to do this, we can solve this by actually making this over here scrollable. So right now, how are we rendering this? Well, we're rendering it by iterating through every single element and we're putting it inside of this column. So one thing I want to do and fix right away is this probably should be its own separate widget. So we should have a widget called something like to-do list widget that should render all of the to-do card widgets. So let's go about doing that right now. So we're going to say to-do list dot dart. This is going to be a stateless widget. It's not going to manage any state. So we're going to say stateless widget. Let's go ahead and import material dart. And then we're going to call this to-do list. And now what we are going to do is, well, of course, all we want to do is we want to render all of the to-do cards. But how do we want to render them? Well, we could render them as a column, but in that case, we're just going to run into the same issue. We're going to have that overflow problem. So instead, what we should actually do is use a separate widget for this. And there's actually a very important widget called a list view widget that will help us out with this. Now, if we want to use the list view widget, we first have to define the height of the container. So the reason for this is because the container can be any maximum width, and the list view widget is going to take as much width as possible. So the reason why that's important is because, well, that's going to take, the width is going to be infinity and we're not going to be able to see it. So what we need to do is we need to set a boundary over here saying that the height is 500. Let's get rid of that note. And so over here we have our container. And now what we need to do is, well, we need the list view widget. So the list, and so we're going to return the child, which is the list view widget. And what we're going to do is we're going to say list view widget dot builder. And so what the list view widget dot builder does is it only renders the items that we actually end up seeing. So it doesn't render every single card. It only sees the ones that we have seen, and the more we scroll, the more that is going to render. And this is going to be a method that's going to take in the item builder, and the item builder is a function that is going to build out our items. And what is the item? Well, the item that we want to go ahead and create is the to-do card. So this might not make a lot of sense, but let me just quickly go over this again. So we have this container, we set a height of 500 because the container can be as big as any of its children. So if its children is 500, well, the container can be 500. However, the list view is going to take the maximum possible space that it can, and thus we have over here something that can be as big as its child, and then this over here can take the maximum amount of space that it can. It's just going to be the height is going to be infinity. So we need to set a height of 500. So this can take the maximum that it can, which is 500. And then over here we're using the builder method because we're using the list view.builder because we don't want to render every single card because that's going to decrease performance. And thus, consequently, we're going to use this builder method that's only going to render the cards that we see, and then maybe maybe a few that we don't see, so that we can easily scroll through it. And once we scroll through it, it's going to render the rest. And over here, we have this method that we have to create that is going to build out the items that we want to create as well. So in order to actually create the to-do cards, well, we need the to-dos from the main.dart file. So to do this, we have to, of course, get it from the main.dart file. So over here, we can say final list, and then remember, this is going to be to-do, so we can auto import that in. And then we're going to say to-dos here. And then over here, of course, in the constructor, we're going to say that we're going to get this through required this dot to-dos. So in here, what we can simply do is, and we should probably colon this, in here what we can do is instead of rendering, where is it? I'm kind of lost here. Okay, right here. Instead of rendering this, all you can do is just call the to-do list widget. And then we can say that, hey, this is going to be a to-do. We're going to pass in the to-dos over here. Very simple. All right, cool. Now it's yelling about the item builder. So now what we can do is we can say that this is going to be a callback. So this is going to be a callback. And this callback is going to take in the context that it is in. So the context. So remember, the context is right here. And this is going to be the context of the current widget that we're on, which is the list view widget. This is going to be automatically passed in. Do not worry. And then it is going to have the index as the second parameter. So it's going to have the index as the second parameter. I'm just going to leave it as I. And the index is going to be really, really important. So now what we want to do in here is we want to return, well, we want to return the to-do card. So we want to go ahead over here and say we want to return the to-do card. And in here, well, of course, we have to pass in a lot of the different parameters. So we're going to have to say title. So we're going to say title. And the title is going to be the to-dos of the index that we're currently iterating over. And then dot title. And then similarly over here, we're also going to need the completed. We're going to say to-dos, the index that we're currently iterating over, dot completed. And lastly, we're going to need actually, I don't think we need anything else, right? That's pretty much it. So the problem here is that we're not actually importing the to-do card. So let's go ahead and let's import that to-do card. And now we get all this extra stuff. So let's go here. Let's just get rid of, you know what? Let's just restart. It's kind of a mess. So let's go here. I think we can restart by doing this. Nope. I am really confused now. Let's go here. Let's get rid of that. Sorry about that. I got really confused and there was a lot of pressure being on camera. So I fixed it up. So it should look something like this. So now we have our item builder that is going to iterate through all of our to-dos. And then it's going to, for each to-do, is going to pass in the correct title as well as the correct completed status. So the last thing that we actually need to do is tell our builder how many items we have in totality. And that's just going to be the length of our list. So over here we can say item count, and then we can say to-dos dot length. Very simple. So if I were to refresh this, now what we can do is go over here and you can see that we finally have a scrollable list. So we have this awesome scrollable list, and if I were to add another element, I'm just going to put in some gibberish, add, oh yeah, right. We haven't did the thing where over here you can see here that we have added it, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elements, and it is nice and scrollable. In this section, what we are going to be doing is learning how to remove the modal when we add a to-do. So currently what's happening is when we add a new to-do, it opens this modal and then we add the to-do and then we add it. But then what we have to do is we have to go ahead and manually remove the modal, which is not a good experience. So we want to remove the modal as soon as we add a new to-do. Well, it's actually really, really simple to do this. All we have to do is go to that modal that we're showing, which is the new_dart file. And then in here on the onPressed, what we're going to do is we're going to tell it that, hey, we want this widget to leave. And how are we going to tell it that we want this widget to leave? Well, we're going to use the Navigator. And this is a very important class that is in charge of navigating our entire application. So we're going to say Navigator, and then we're going to tell it, okay, which widget do we want to manipulate? Which widget do we want to navigate? Well, we're going to do that with the context. So we're going to say of context. And remember, this is going to be passed in by here, the build widget. And then what we're going to say is pop. Very, very simple. So right after we go ahead and add it, we're going to go ahead and pop it. So now if I were to add this, add something in there, and you can see that it pops. Now it's really slow on my machine. Apologies. Hopefully it's a little smoother on yours. But you can see here, let me try to do this again. You can see that it pops and it removes. In this section, what I want to do is cover third-party packages and how we can use them inside of our Flutter application. So specifically what I want to do is, you know, when we have our new to-do, we end up calling this add to-do function. And over here, we pass in the text that is inside of the input. So if you do control and then click on this, it takes you to the actual function where it is being called. And this is going to be inside of the main.dart file. So this right here is going to take in a string and it's going to add a to-do to the to-do list. However, right now, the ID is, we just statically generate it. It's not dynamic, it is not unique. So what I want to do is I want to have some random gibberish string for every single one. And specifically what I really want is a UUID. Now how do I add a UUID? Well, there's actually a package that we can use, and you can go over here to pub.dev to see all of the different Flutter packages. And you can see here that this is a third-party library that we can actually install into our application. And therefore, what it does is it just allows us to use this UUID method right over here. And let me just zoom in. Now, how do we add this third-party library inside of our application? Well, it's really easy. What we do is we copy this over here, UUID and the version, and then we go to our pub.spec. This is our package manager, if you will. And over here, we add this to our dependencies. And so we go ahead and we save this. So once we save this, it's going to go ahead and add that into our dependencies. And then inside of the main.dart file, what we can now do is go ahead and import that necessary dependency. So we can say import, and you can probably get the import from here. I happen to know the import by heart, and that is going to be import, and then it's going to be import package, and then it's going to be the name of the package, and then slash uuid.dart. So this is the name of the package, and we're going to get it from uuid.dart. Let's also add a colon in there. And so now what we have is access to that UUID. So over here, we can just say UUID and just invoke it. Now this is going to be a problem because type string is actually different from type UUID. So now what we need to do is copy this as well, and then go to our todo.dart file, import that in, and instead of this being type of ID or string, we're gonna say type of UUID. So we're gonna go ahead, save that, and then over here we shouldn't have that error anymore. Well, we do have that error right here, and that's because this also should now be UUID. So, and you can also remove this if you want. You can start off with an empty array or a list. But I'm just going to keep it like that for now. So now if we were to save this, you can see that our application is up and running and is still really good. So that's really how we add third-party libraries. We just put them inside of the dependencies right over here. And we can do this for any single one. We pretty much built out our application. We can scroll through our list. Over here, this is dynamically changing. We can also add things over here by triggering a modal, and this modal has validation, and it can also leave as soon as we add it to do. The only thing that is missing is when we click on a card, this should go ahead and update the status. So it should update this status over here. So how are we going to trigger some sort of function call that's going to update the state of our list when we click on a to-do? So you might be thinking, well, we can go to the to-do card, and inside of the fractionally sized box or the card, we can have something like an on press. However, this doesn't really work, or on press. This doesn't work because the only widgets that really have that on pressed is a button. So you might be thinking, okay, maybe we just wrap the whole thing in a button. That's not really a good idea either. So instead, what we can actually use is a special component called gesture detector, or sorry, a special widget called gesture detector. And what this widget is going to do is, well, detect the gesture, and then it is going to trigger some function. So over here inside of our card, we can actually take everything and then use gesture detector. And we can say that this is a child. And we can say that the child is everything that we have passed in over here. So by doing this, by wrapping our whole card inside of a gesture detector, we have access to multiple different properties. So over here we have on tap up, on tap down, on tap, on double tap, on long press, so many different things. Over here, I want to use on tap, and I'm going to call a function when we tap on this card. And I'm just going to print tapped. I'm going to print tapped, I'm colon here. And now let's just perform the hot reload. And now when I press on this, press on this, press on this, you should see that I get tapped right over here. So that is really how we are going to detect these gestures and then invoke a function. So that's pretty much it. So now what we need to do is we need to call a function that's going to update the to-dos. And so this function is probably going to live inside of the main.dart file and then passed to the new new underscore to-dos.dart file. And so how is this function going to update things? Well, I'm thinking that this function can also get the index of whatever. So this is the card function, and it's going to have a special index. For instance, this is going to have an index of 2. So it's going to get the index, and then it's going to invoke the function, passing in the index, and then the function inside of the main.dart file is going to take that index, so say it's index 1, and then toggle this to either true or false. In this case, it's going to be true. So let's actually just code it out, and hopefully it makes a little bit of sense. So let's go in here, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a method that's not going to return anything. So we're going to say void, and we're going to say update to do completions. And this is going to take in whatever index that we want to update. So what to-do do we want to update? We're going to get that through the index. And so in here, what we're going to simply do is just say set state, and then we're going to say to-do, the to-do at the index that we want to change. We want to change its completed status to the to-do at the index that we want to change. Then we want to get its completed status. So this is going to be either false or true. But then what we want to do is we want to flip it. So we're going to go ahead and flip it, and then let's put our colon. So what this is going to do is it's going to be either true or false, but by adding this exclamation mark, it's going to flip it to the opposite value. So if it's true, it's going to flip it to false. And if it's false, it's going to flip it to true. And that's how we can actually toggle this. So now what we can do, and we can actually make this private. Now what we can do is we can actually pass this into the to-do cards. But first, in order to pass this into the to-do cards, we need to pass it into the to-do list, because the to-do list is the thing that's housing all of the cards. So in here, what we can do very, very simply is go to the over here to the variables that we want to pass, and we can say that, hey, we want to also pass a function that takes in an integer, and we're going to call this function update to do completions. Update to do completions. All right, very simple. And then over here, we're going to require that in. So we're going to say over here, update to do completions. All right, so that fixes that problem. And now inside of the main.dart file, this is going to give us an error. So you can just simply say now update to do completions is going to be, well, update to do completions method that we have just created. So update to do completions. All right, so now it's not yelling at us anymore. Now inside of this, what we want to do is now we want to pass it inside of the to-do card. So let's actually clean this up a little bit here, because right now we're only taking the completed as well as the title. So now we also want to get the index of the card as well as that function that we want to call. So inside of the to-do card, let's just save that. Inside of the to-do card, let's get rid of this tapped print. No need for that now. Let's clean this up a little bit here. And let's just, well, what do we want? Well, let's go back here. We want this, so we can say we want this method because we're going to call it within this card. And then we also want the index. So we can say final, and then we can say the index. So simply here, we can just say required, and then this dot update to do completions. I think I misspelled it here. Update to do completions. Update to do completions. There we go. So I misspelled that there. And over here, update to do completions. And then over here, we also want the index. So this dot index. So we can save that now. And if I go to the list, it should yell at me over here. So very simply, we can just say update to do completions as well, update to do completions. And then the index is going to be I in this case. So I, remember we have that here. So now, very, very simply, let's just quickly refresh this. And let's actually go to the main.dart file. This should be changed to to-do this time. All right, very cool. And so now what we can do inside of our card, where is that? Right here, is we can just go ahead and call this function and pass in the index. That's really all we have to do. And then the magic is done. So let's just go ahead and now let's click on this, and you can see that it flips. So you can see here that it actually works and everything is working all fine and dandy. All right, cool. And you can see you can flip-flop back and forth. Now, one last quick thing that I missed. When this reaches the numerator and the denominator are exactly the same, I want this to be green. So simply to do that, we can just go to the counter. And then over here, we can say that the text styles, so we can say the color. So we can say something like, if the total completed double equals the number of to-dos, then what we want is the colors to be green, else we want the colors to be black. So now if I were to save this, it should turn green. If I were to go here, it goes back to black. Just to quickly go through exactly what I did here. If you understand, you can pretty much finish this video off. But I'm just going to quickly explain what I did here because I feel like it could be a little bit confusing. So what we did was we created in our main.dart file, we created this method. Let's go back here. We created this method that is going to take in an index and it's going to update the completed status of the to-do at that index. So if this was index 1, it's going to go over here and change this completed status to true. We do that by getting the opposite of what the value is. And then we pass this to the to-do list. So we pass this to the to-do list. The reason why we have to pass this to the to-do list is because the to-do list is what's housing the to-do cards. So we go over here, we pass it to the to-do list. And then the to-do list, what it does is it takes in that method and then it passes it to the to-do card and also passes in the current index of that card. And then the to-do card, what it does is on tap, it calls this method and it calls that index. So I hope that makes sense, and that's pretty much the video. Hopefully you guys learned a lot, and I'll see you guys in the next one.